Well, first of all, I would like to say my name is Yunji, and I am Korean. And I'm Korean, and I was born in Korea, but I've lived in 5 different countries, including Canada. And I think I have a lot of pride in that. Being Korean, having Korean roots, and have lived in 5 different countries means a lot to myself and my identity. So yeah, I do tell people that I'm Korean, but I've also lived in many different countries. And I do always want to make sure that my pronouns are she, her, and hers, because I understand that, that's very important for us to make it clear. And I do also like to think myself as an activist, in the sense that I'm always curious about learning about the world, and especially a lot of those stories that are not told or even kind of silenced in some sense. So I try my best to learn about all those stories and try to do what I can do to make a difference, or at least bring those stories to the surface, because I believe that's the right thing to do. So when I was 4 years old, my dad, so he works for a company that has sort of like a chain company outside of Korea, so they would send people to those countries. So we went to Malaysia when I was 4, so I lived in KL for around 4 years. And then we came back to Korea when I was in elementary school. And then for middle school, we went to Thailand because of my dad's job. So we were in Pattaya. It's on near the water, it's the coast. And then for high school, they moved him to Japan. So I lived in Tokyo for 4 years, and then I wanted to continue my studies in English. So then I came here alone, Canada. So that would be Korea, Malaysia, Thailand, Japan, and Canada, so 5 different countries. Those are my 5 countries, and I really consider myself very fortunate to have had those opportunities, because that doesn't come to anyone, right? And I would like to think that I did do my best to make the best out of those opportunities, and it really did push me into, I think, one of the reasons why I am in this field right now, of wanting to kind of especially speak of those stories of minorities, is because I lived in so many different environments where I was able to kind of broaden my horizon and also learn about my privilege, but also my kind of status as a woman of color and someone who understands that some stories are not always told. So I think living in 5 different countries really did help me and kind of build me into becoming the person I am today and the kind of work I want to do today. Right, for example, so I would say in middle school and high school, I was in a pretty, I was in a British international school, so the classroom was very, I'm not sure what the right term is, but very Western dominated. And we would always, even history classes and geography classes, we would learn about World War and all these social issues from more the Western perspective. And I remember one time I was talking about the colonial history of Korea as a way to explain the ongoing tension today between Korea and Japan. But some students called me dramatic for that. And then I started actually crying because I was embarrassed, because the whole classroom was filled with they were kind of like, oh, Yunji got burned. And then when I started crying, it was silenced, right? And I was the only Korean kid in the class. And I think that kind of made me realize how I felt so unheard. I felt like I couldn't really talk about my stories and my history. And that kind of traumatized me in some sense, that I didn't really feel comfortable talking about my stories or just about Korea. And it did really make me realize how unknown the history is of Korea, but also Japan and just East Asia and Asia in general, to be honest. And I mean, when we think about World War history, we don't really talk about the effects of World War II on Asia. We know Japan was part of it, but that's kind of it. We talk about Pearl Harbor, but not so much on what happened in Hiroshima. And but then when I moved to Vancouver, I think that helped me a lot, because being in a very ethnically diverse community, and also having seen Indigenous people being able to really speak up and people listening to them, I think that kind of gave me courage and the understanding that, oh, I can speak about, these stories that's not as well known. And, when I attended the march, the Women's Memorial March to remember the missing and murdered Indigenous women, it really showed how, they really inspired me to kind of break my silence around the stories that I cared about. And that's what kind of pushed me to start my Instagram series on commemorating and remembering the comfort women, which are women and girls who were forced into sexual slavery by Imperial Japan during World War II. And I got messages from strangers from the Philippines thanking me for kind of speaking on their behalf about their unspoken history. And I also had a couple of Caucasian friends kind of thanking me for starting this series because it really helped them kind of self-reflect their sort of historical ignorance in some sense. So yeah, I don't know if I'm going kind of off tangent here, I guess what I'm trying to say is that being in a very Western-dominated environment, being in a British school, with being the only Korean kid in class, not many were Asian either, it really did, I felt very unheard, and it really showed me how unknown a lot of history there are in the world, not only the comfort women issue, but in Asia in general. And then when I moved to Vancouver, where I was in an environment which was so much more ethnically diverse and so many groups just advocating for themselves and also other minority groups, I think that just really inspired me and pushed me to speak more about the unknown history. And yeah, I guess that kind of is where it all started. And yeah, the first time I learned about comfort women was definitely when I was in elementary school / middle schools, and it helps that I am Korean myself and it's part of our history, although it's not addressed appropriately in Korea. One of the big misconceptions that people have is that the comfort women history is political, but the Korean government's actually not doing anything about it. That's actually another issue, but anyways, that's another another story. But yeah, so because it's part of our history, because it happened during the colonial occupation of Korea by Japan, and I think as someone who lived outside of Korea, I think this influence comes from my parents as well, but I've always wanted to make sure I know my history, not just colonial history, but just Korea, history of Korea, as well as our heritage and roots, because my experience, I didn't have a lot of Korean people around me, so I felt like that responsibility of teaching about Korea was on me. I felt like an ambassador in some sense, so I've always felt like I needed to be curious and informed about my own history and my own stories. And is why, while I was learning about all those things, comfort women was a big part of the history that I learned that took a big part of colonial history of Korea. Of course. And of course, I first do want to mention again that I don't know everything and I'm not an expert on this issue of East Asian history and Korea-Japan relations. But what I can say is Korea was colonized by Japan starting 1904 or 5. I'll get you the exact date. It's not on top of my mind.
I can edit it.
Yes, thank you so much. And we were liberated in 1945 with the end of World War II, when Japan had to, of course, give up all the colonized land, which includes us, as well as other East Asian countries, as well as Southeast Asian countries. And during this time, especially during World War II, before World War II, so as a colony, not only specific to Japanese colonialism, but in any colonial context, Korean people were forced not to speak Korean. And in fact, I remember speaking to my grandma who said that she had to relearn Korean when she was in elementary school after the liberation because they were forced to speak Japanese and learn Japanese in class. Kind of, parallel to what's been happening in the residential schools in Canada, right? Trying to get the Indian out of them, trying to educate them, make them Canadian, and enforcing that English education and language on them. Of course, to a very different extent. I can't compare these two as like the same extent of historical events, but what I'm saying is there is a similarity of that trying to take away their language. And so that happened, and of course forced labor is a huge thing as well. And during World War II, because Japan was, one of the countries included in the World War II event, Korean men were taken away and were forced to fight on the Japanese side, as well as women and girls and women who were taken away through human trafficking, lies, and like lied promises saying, oh, you're gonna be working for the factory, but in fact they were going to these comfort stations where they were forced to provide sexual slavery, like services to the Japanese soldiers. So that happened during World War II. Yeah, so the account is commemorating comfort women. And if you want to find the Instagram account, it's commemoratecomfortwomen. And I started 2 years ago after watching after participating in one of the webinars on kind of remembering the comfort women. August 14th is the International Day for Comfort Women. It's the Memorial Day for Comfort Women. Not a lot of people know, but it's a day, save the date. So that day 2 years ago, I was watching a webinar about it, and one of the activists in the webinar was saying how we have so little survivors left and we're really running out of time. And I think that's when it kind of made me realize I wanted to do something. And that's something I could do is to make sure that, there's so many testimonies out there, like I mentioned before, so many survivors came forward and spoke up, and I wanted to make sure their voices were not wasted. So I started the Instagram series initially to just kind of have their voices out there, make sure their stories are not forgotten. And how I started was I reached out to multiple comfort women organizations, and of which there is CARE, there is Korean Council, Lila Filipinas, so many. But yeah, I reached out to them and asked if I could have any resources, and they gave me resources, which were the testimonies of women. There's a lot of books, a lot of documents that has these survivors' voices and testimony. So that's the resource that I use to quote and where I get their stories. So bi-weekly I try to feature one survivor at a time. So I would tell their stories. Of course, I don't copy paste all their story as much as I would love to. Kind of going back to what I said about using social media as a tool, as much as I would love everyone to read the entire story, I know that people's what's the word? Focus, the attention span is very short. And in order to make this account effective is for me to try and take out the most sort of important parts and concise it into 10-page Instagram. Yeah, on Instagram you have 10 pages max. So yeah, that's what I try to do. So I read their stories, I try to put it together, and I also try to define certain words by putting an asterisk sign at the end if the word is unknown. For instance, in the beginning of the series, I defined what comfort woman was, and I also there's a lot of Japanese, Korean, Filipino words that people may not understand, but it makes sense to the survivors because they're telling their story, right? So then I would try to put an asterisk and then explain that. So that's what I would do, and then I always, not all the time, but I try to connect their stories to kind of show why it's important for us to care, why it's relevant to us. So for instance, what I mean by that is the series would have, so the photo itself would be their testimony, their stories. But in the description of my post, I would always try to connect it to today's ongoing sexual violence, or why it's important that we care, or what's been going on today with the issue. For instance, the ongoing historical denialist trying to erase history, and is why it's more important for us to listen to their story. And then I would also try to bring in trauma, and how, you know, this constant denial and ignorance around this topic of comfort women have led to continued suffering of the survivors, and how this connects to other examples of sexual violence, on and on. So that's what my description part would be. And that would be, so this is bi-weekly, and I cover Korean survivors, Filipina survivors, Chinese survivors, Taiwanese survivors, and I've been trying to look into more Indonesian survivors as well, because I really want to cover everyone. But unfortunately, there's not a lot of research and an account on Indonesian survivors, especially in English. And I have actually spoken to a professor who specializes in Indonesian survivors, but he did say it's going to take some time for it to be translated and all that. Yeah, that's another thing about this comfort women issue, is that there's sort of like not limited, but not a lot of accounts translated into English, which does make it a bit more difficult. So that is my comfort women series. And so just to wrap it up again, I try to bring the survivors' voices and their stories, and I try to connect it, and I try to add a description of my interpretation of why their stories matter and how we should understand that, especially trying to tie into today's ongoing issue of sexual violence and conflict that still is very outshadowed by many other international issues. Yeah, and I get the resources from connections, other comfort women organizations, and researchers and academics.
Yeah, and you post usually on Wednesday,
every
right?
2 weeks. Yes. Oh, yes. Thank you. That's actually a good point. So the reason why I post on Wednesday is so in 1991, August 14th, which was Wednesday, Miss Kim Hak-soon was the first survivor to break the silence around this on this issue of comfort women, which is a euphemistic term actually. So we put it in quotation mark, but you know, of course the proper term is sexual slavery system by Imperial Japan during World War II, but we do call it comfort woman. But yeah, so she was the first comfort woman to speak up about this experience, which honestly led to a lot of other survivors to speak up, and this issue was finally brought to the international kind of like attention, and that's when the whole movement started. So I wanted to kind of, I guess like that's the reason why I decided to post every other Wednesday, because yeah, the first survivor to speak about this issue was on a Wednesday. So that's why the acronym for my series is actually CWCW, which is Comfort Women Commemoration Wednesday. Yeah. So I did have experience working with the survivors. I was able to speak to one of them in one of many events that I went to for the Comfort Women movement, and I remember her saying that she felt ashamed and she felt unheard. She felt that this continuous stigmatization around sexual violence was kind of like a second rape to her. Like she was already going through this trauma from the experience she had as a little girl, you know, having to endure sexual violence as a comfort woman. But now that prejudice around sexual violence and the view, like the way people treat her as a sexual violence victim, kind of makes her feel even more unheard, and it doesn't help with her healing and doesn't help with her trying to restore her dignity from what has happened. But despite all that, she was saying that she is going to continue fighting and she's going to continue speaking of her experience, because this speaking of her experience and just being able to talk about it helped her. And it changed her from a victim to an activist, because she also understands that this is a human rights problem, and she wants us to learn, acknowledge this historical example so we can bring an end to future potential sexual violence and armed conflict. And I think when she was talking about that, I was just very inspired by that. And not her, but so many survivors courageously spoke up about this experience despite it still being a very stigmatized topic. Some of them had their families cut ties with them because they spoke up about this, because it's so shameful. But despite that, I guess just them being so courageous and wanting to speak up about this issue made me wanting to make sure that their voices weren't wasted. So the best way for me, in my mind, for me to kind of bring justice to them and make sure their voices are not forgotten was to use the social media account to tell their stories and make sure I'm kind of throwing their stories at people's faces, being like, listen to their story. This is what happened and why it matters. And just trying to keep their voices kind of alive, I guess, in some sense. Fortunately, a lot of them have passed away, but, just because they passed away doesn't mean that the experience is gone, right? Like, it did happen, and is why it's even more important for us to keep listening to their stories and remembering. And I think that's a big part of my social media account goal, is remembering and making sure their voices are heard so that we don't forget this historical atrocity. So I would say that's the first reason to why I really wanted to, why I am dedicated in this Instagram series. Yeah, I think Canada surprised me in a good way. So in the sense that, I think the thing about Canada is, of course, I don't want to generalize, and I don't know much about the Canadian education system, but what I realized is that Canada has been pretty friendly to me, in the sense that whenever I try to speak of this topic, I think they have an underlying, what's the word? There's this underlying understanding that it's more welcoming, if that makes sense. Because I think Canada as a country, compared to many other countries, at least from my experience, is that they do talk about historical atrocities. They do look at historical wrongdoings, even though a lot more can be done. For instance, what happened with, First Nations, Indigenous people. I was really surprised when I first moved to Canada, and in university, in my first year class, we were talking about the atrocities that was done to the Indigenous peoples. And I was like, wow, we learn about these things, we talk about these things. And when I tried to create some parallel between that and the comfort women issue, my professor was very supportive of that, and I was able to write papers on the comfort women issue as well during my gender, race, sexual justice class, where we had to talk about intersectionality of where race, sexuality come together, and how that can cause an individual from being oppressed, right? And I was able to use that concept to talk about the comfort women issue. So I guess in Canada, I think what I'm trying to say is that I felt more comfortable speaking about the issue, because I knew that Canada's already, for me, I saw Canada as already a country that really tries to talk about these issues, sort of. They can do better, for sure, a lot better. But at least from what I saw back in, for instance, Korea, or I guess my experience living in Japan, where it was very kind of hard for me to talk about these topics. I think people were more accepting in that way. I don't know if that makes sense, but people were more willing to listen. And again, I think kind of going back to what I said about participating in the March of the Missing and Murder to remember the missing and murdered Indigenous women, I think that inspired me as well on wanting to speak. Sorry, I guess what I'm trying to say is that compared to Korea, Japan, and Malaysia and Thailand, I think in Canada there is, at least in Vancouver, there is an effort to wanting to decolonize a lot of things and wanting to, and like there are voices of the marginalized and oppressed groups who want to kind of like speak up and bring their stories to the surface, which I didn't really experience in other environments that I was in. Right, for sure. Of course, like I do have to say that I don't know all of them, and that's part of the reason why I'm constantly trying to do my best to learn more about other like historical atrocities or atrocities today that aren't on the front page of the news, right? So I just want to make it clear that like I don't know everything. I'm still also very ignorant about many events that's happening in the world today. But two events that I learned was from my experience. So in 2020, me and my very good friend Melissa Tan, we organized a panel discussion on sexual violence in Asia for the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at UBC. And there we covered comfort women, but also two other atrocities, of which one was the minority, Uyghur minority in China, in Xinjiang, and what's been happening to women there, because women in Xinjiang are also facing sort of an ethnic cleansing where, you know, because of them having a female body, rape and sexual violence is used as a way to kind of ethnically cleanse the minority and also like culturally like genocide. So that was one thing that I would have not known about if I didn't organize this event, because I did know about the war crime, not war crime, but what's been happening in Xinjiang with the Uyghur minority. But again, although these topics and issues are talked about, we don't really focus a lot on the sexual violence part of it. So I think I only learned that sexual violence was very prominent in this issue of the Uyghur minority in Xinjiang as well because of this organization, because of my work in organizing this panel discussion. And then the third one was the indigenous women in Bangladesh. We had Prabodhi, she's actually a PhD student at UBC as well, and she spoke about the sexual violence that the indigenous women in Bangladesh had to endure because of the conflict. And yeah, so that was another example that I was able to learn, and that I definitely would have not known if I didn't speak to Prabodhi or if I didn't organize this event. And you know, there's so many more, and if you actually look into the UN report on sexual violence, there's actually so many cases that we don't really know about, like a lot in Africa, a lot in Asia, and in Ukraine today as well. Like we do mention, I mean, Ukraine is huge today, and we do talk about the atrocities happening in Ukraine, but I do think more focus has to be given to sexual violence and just rape being used as a weapons of war. But yeah, so yeah, there's many more, but I would say the two that I learned more about is the Uyghur minority in Xinjiang and the women there who had to endure sexual violence, and also the indigenous women in Bangladesh as well. Mm-hmm. For example, that panel discussion that I just told you about, in the beginning, me and my partner Melissa, we were only going to focus on the comfort woman issue, but then we did think, you know what, I think it's important for us to look at the broader issue of sexual violence and armed conflict. And when we were looking into that, of course, we had very limited knowledge on, what other examples can we bring in? And I think that's what kind of pushed us to look into very different kind of sectors of work. So we reached out to academics, we reached out to film directors, we reached out to activists, NGOs, and things like that. So I think as we try to learn about other examples of sexual violence and conflict, and we also wanted to make sure that we're not only presenting the issue from an academic standpoint, it did push us to make creation with other like sectors, right? Like I said, business, filmmaking, art, and like community engagement, like NGOs. And I think that was actually a very big learning experience for me, because I actually used to only think research was not only research, but I thought research was the most effective way to kind of bring change and advocate for this issue of comfort women, and not only comfort women, but just sexual violence and armed conflict. But by organizing this panel discussion and connecting with all these people in different fields trying to make a difference in their own way, I think that helped me realize that, oh, you know what, there's so many ways you can bring voices to these untold stories, and so many ways you can kind of bring social good. And also, I learned that I really enjoyed bringing different people together for a cause. And that's actually the reason why I decided to look into an MBA program myself. And it's why I'll be doing a dual degree in global affairs and MBA, because I really do believe in the power of cross-sectoral collaboration in bringing change, because I found that very effective. Like, community engagement and collaboration is such an important and effective tool to utilize in kind of engaging the public and promoting and stimulating a conversation around kind of uncomfortable topics like sexual violence and armed conflict. Because what I realized from this panel discussion that I organized is that people were more engaged and more, what's a better word? More engaged and more understanding of the importance of not only comfort women issue, but importance of these historical examples of sexual violence, because we were speaking of it from very different perspectives, if that makes sense. So, and also the fact that it wasn't only academic, because I think because a lot of the comfort women issue, as well as other examples of sexual violence, it is, we kind of come across it more from an academic perspective, right? Like, there's papers about it, there's UN reports about it, and it's a bit more academic, which can be a bit hard for some people who don't have previous knowledge in this field to kind of understand and digest. But when we bring in like a filmmaker, like for instance, we have Tiffany, who directed The Apology, which is the documentary on comfort women. I think that really helped people learn about the issue in a more, it was more approachable in that sense. Many of my friends will know, including you, that I am not really good on keeping up to date on social media. I'm very slow at responding. I don't really inform my friends on what I've been up to. Social media to me has been sort of pressure to me. Like, I'm not really on my phone. Many people say they think I'm actually in my 40s, 50s. I am not good with technology, of which social media is one of them. But I think, starting this Instagram series, I realized that it is a very effective tool in engaging with the public, and is why it changed my perspective towards technology. And I've been trying to learn more about technology, trying to keep up to date with the technological advancements that's been happening. Before it was not my interest. Whenever, let's say the new iPhone came out, or like AI, whatever it is, I was just like, whatever. Like, it was really not my interest. But now I really try to pay attention to those things, because just like how social media helped me reach out to the community and enable community engagement, I believe I want to also know about other technology that I could utilize in the future, or even now, as a tool to really engage with the public. Like, for instance, I know this one NGO, Comfort Women NGO, where they used AI, artificial intelligence, to kind of create this like virtual one-on-one conversation with the survivors. So what it is that the public can actually have a conversation with the survivor who passed away, but they used the artificial intelligence technology to be able to have a conversation and that close connection with the survivor, which has helped the public to kind of get that close interaction with a sexual violence survivor. Which has really pushed them to wanting to, play a role in addressing sexual violence. So yeah, like I guess like personal change is that I am now more aware of not just technology but other mediums, and is why I'm also looking into doing an MBA myself, because before I only looked at education, research being the most effective, in fact only tool that I knew of bringing this issue to the people. But now I'm realizing that there's so many other ways, so many tools that I can use to do that, and it's why I want to open my mind and not be tunnel visioned, because I used to be tunnel visioned on history, research is the only way to go. I didn't even care about MBA, I didn't even care about technology, all those things. So it did help me to kind of broaden my horizon, if that makes sense. Yeah, for sure. I think creation is very important for me because it's doing something that would have not happened otherwise. It's actually what my really close professor told me to sort of help me realize why creation is important and why he thinks I'd be good at it. It's because, the Comfort Woman series, it allows me to really engage the public into this issue that's really well unknown, and this issue that is not very pleasant but very important. And is why this creation is important for me, because it's allowing me to play that role in helping the public to change their kind of mindset around this stigmatization around sexual violence, and also playing a role to make sure we can bring an end to sexual violence. So that's why creation is important for me, because it's a tool that allows people to get engaged in doing their part in this social issue. And also, it's kind of a selfish reason, but it makes me feel good. It makes me feel good to know that, I'm able to, play a positive influence in bringing social change. And the second reason why creation is important for me, because it's my way of sort of letting my emotions out. I think being Korean myself and coming from a culture where we have a lot of respect for the elders, and we see them as people who are wise and are there to give us advice about our life, because they lived more than us, so they obviously must have gone through a lot of experiences and made mistakes that would allow them to give good advice to us. So elder is actually a very positive word for me. And in terms of my interpretation as emerging elder, I gave it some thought when you reached out to me about you as an emerging elder. I was like, what does that mean? Does that mean I'm getting older? I mean, it's true, I'm getting older, but I had a thought about it, and I think I kind of can see it as just an individual who's trying to do their best to push their community towards change and doing the right thing. And if that's the right definition of emerging elder, I do want to give myself a little credit for trying to be that figure. And like I said before, I think that does motivate me and gives me a sort of sense of responsibility of trying to do what I'm doing right now, of trying to not only educate the public about these unspoken social issues, but trying to do my best in pushing the community to learn more on these topics, not only on sexual violence and armed conflict, but also these, just these social issues that's not really spoken about, and pushing the community to wanting to do something to play a part in addressing these social challenges. Yeah.